The air was thick with the smell of sun-baked earth and the lowing of cattle, a scent as familiar to me as my own sweat. It was the smell of home, of the Circle T Ranch, a life I'd carved out of this unforgiving Arizona territory with my own two hands. But on that day, the familiar scent was laced with something else, something sharp and metallic that made my horse, Cracker, prance nervously beneath me. It was the smell of fear, and it was coming from the 30 or so Apache who stood across from us, silent as the granite peaks that watched over the valley. We were there for a parley, a fragile truce to negotiate the fate of a stolen herd. But the real reason was to stop the bloodshed that had been painting the desert red for the past year. I stood with the other ranchers, my thumb rubbing a smooth, worry-worn stone in my pocket, a nervous habit I'd had since I was a boy, my heart pounding against my ribs. I expected demands. I expected threats. I expected another cycle of anger and retaliation. What I didn't expect was for the old Apache leader, a man named Chato whose face was a roadmap of 1,000 sorrows, to step forward and make an offer that silenced even the wind. His name was Chato, though I learned that later. At that moment, he was just a figure carved from the mountainside itself, an apparition of sinew and bone and deep, unyielding silence. He was not a tall man, but the way he stood, with the kind of stillness that only comes from a life lived on the edge of a knife, made him seem to fill the whole valley. His moccasins made no sound on the hard-packed earth as he took 2, 3, 4 deliberate steps forward, separating himself from the cluster of his people. They were a collection of lean men and women, their faces a mixture of defiance and a weariness so profound it seemed to be a part of their very bones. Their eyes, dark and obsidian-hard, watched us with a guarded intensity that set my teeth on edge. I was a rancher, not a soldier, and the only Apache I'd ever seen up close were the ones I'd traded with for furs or, more recently, the ones I'd fired at from behind a wagon. I had a personal stake in this parley that went beyond the usual rancher's grievance. My brother Elias had been taken in a raid 3 months prior. Not killed, not found, just gone. The army said he was likely dead, but the absence of a body was a thorn of hope I couldn't pull out. They'd taken our cattle, sure, but taking my brother, that was a wound that festered and wouldn't heal. The other ranchers were here for their livelihood. I was here for a ghost. My mind was a fog of questions and a desperate, foolish hope. I fiddled with the stone in my pocket, a piece of smooth, black obsidian from the lava beds to the south. It was a habit I'd picked up from my father, a way to keep my hands busy when my mind was a whirlwind. The rough edges were long gone, polished by a lifetime of worry. The silence stretched between our two groups, a living, breathing thing. I could hear the creak of leather from the saddle of the man next to me, a portly rancher named Barnaby who was sweating through his cleanest shirt. He smelled of hog fat and fear. A fly buzzed in a lazy circle around his head, landing on his nose. He didn't even swat it. On our side, we had a dozen or so men, armed with rifles and shotguns. We looked like a motley crew of farmers and shopkeepers playing dress-up. Against the Apache, who seemed to melt into the landscape, we looked clumsy and heavy. Then Chato spoke. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. He spoke in his own tongue, a melodic flow of words that was completely alien to my ears. Beside him, a younger warrior translated, his own voice flat and emotionless. "The mountain man says you have forgotten the old ways," the young man said, his gaze never meeting ours. "You have taken our hunting grounds, poisoned our water, and now you come to us to complain about cattle that graze on land that was never yours." A murmur rippled through our group. Barnaby finally swatted the fly, a violent, jerky motion. "That's a lie," he shouted. "That's our God-given land. We have deeds. We have papers." Chato watched him, his face a stoic mask. He said a few more words to the translator, who, in turn, relayed them to us. "The mountain man says paper is the breath of white ghosts. It holds no power in a land that knows only the sun and the rain." It was a philosophical argument, a clash of two worlds that had no common language. We were talking about ownership, about legalities. They were talking about existence. The rising heat was starting to get to me. The sun was climbing to its peak, a white-hot brand in a pale, cloudless sky. Sweat soaked the back of my shirt. My mouth felt like it was full of cotton wool. The obsidian in my pocket was slick with my own perspiration. I remember a specific detail that made the situation feel impossibly real. Chato's hands. They were not the hands of a warrior, not like I'd imagined. I had expected them to be calloused and rough from wielding a hatchet or a bow. They were, but they were also expressive. He held his hands out, palms open, as he spoke. His fingers were long and delicate, with a grace I hadn't anticipated. One finger had a ring, a simple band of dark, unpolished silver. It had an etched pattern, perhaps a clan symbol or a personal totem. It caught the sun and glinted, and for a second it was the only thing moving in the whole tableau. It made him more human. It made the knot of fear in my gut twist into a thorn of sorrow. The conversation was a cycle of accusation and denial, going nowhere. The cattle were a sticking point. 100 head had been driven off from the combined ranches of the valley. We were losing our livelihood. They were losing their way of life. I felt a desperate urge to push past the formalities, to scream at him about my brother. But the protocol of this strange, fragile meeting held me in place. I was just a rancher, a man who knew more about fixing fences than about the complexities of tribal politics. My personal quirk, my nervous stone fiddling, must have seemed pathetic to these hardened people. Then Chato made his offer. He didn't shout it. He didn't make a grand gesture. He spoke as if he were making a simple, obvious statement, one that would solve all our problems. The young translator's face flickered with confusion, his stoic mask cracking for a fraction of a second. Then he translated. "The mountain man says this. The cattle are not the problem. The problem is the blood that has been spilled. We have taken your cattle. We will return half of them to you. But he asks you to consider this. What if a white man were to come to us and make a similar offer to trade our hunting grounds for a piece of paper? We would take that paper and burn it. It is an insult." Again Barnaby began to protest, but Chato held up a hand. The gesture was so commanding that Barnaby fell silent. "He says there is another way," the translator continued, a tremor in his voice now. "He has a son strong bear, who was taken by the bluecoat soldiers a year ago. They have told us he is dead, but we do not believe it. The mountain man offers a trade. For every head of cattle we return, we ask for something of equal value. For our sons you have given us a story. We have given you a story. He is a man of the mountains. He knows every rock, every shadow, every secret path. He has spent his life knowing when to fight and when to be silent. His silence has been his power. He has watched you all, the white people, for a long time. He has seen your greed and your fear. He has seen your brother Elias." My blood turned to ice. My breath caught in my throat. "He is alive," the translator said, his eyes finally meeting mine. "He is with us. He was hurt. He did not fight because he could not. The mountain man says he will free him. He will free his own son. He will mend the wound. He will let the blood be forgotten. For your brother, he asks for nothing but your promise that the fighting will stop, that the boundary lines will be blurred, and we will all learn to see the land as something other than a resource. He offers you your brother, and in return, he asks for only a promise. He asks for a promise that you will see the land as we do." The world went silent. The offer was so profound, so personal, and so impossible that no one in our group seemed to know how to react. We had come expecting a fight over cattle. We had come prepared for a bloody resolution. Instead, a man who had every reason to hate us was offering to give me back my brother in exchange for nothing but peace. It was a deal no one expected. The weight of the offer, the sheer audacity of it, settled on us all like a blanket of snow. He was asking us to put down our rifles and look at the world through his eyes. He was asking us to trust him. The silence that followed Chato's offer was a physical thing, like the sudden, crushing pressure before a thunderstorm. Barnaby's face was a blotchy, mottled red, his mouth opening and closing like a beached fish. Another rancher, a beanpole of a man named Silas, let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh that echoed off the distant buttes before dying a quick, shameful death. No one else joined him. We were all paralyzed, our carefully constructed world of us versus them, of civilization versus savagery, crumbling around our ears. I myself felt like I'd been struck by lightning. The obsidian stone slipped from my nerveless fingers and fell into the dust with a soft thud. Elias was alive. The certainty of his death that I'd been carrying around for 3 months like a lead weight in my gut was suddenly, impossibly, lifted. But it was replaced by a dizzying wave of confusion and suspicion. Why would he do this? What was the trick? My mind, accustomed to the straight lines of business and the simple logic of survival, couldn't process the sheer humanity of the gesture. It felt like a test, a trap of some kind. An Apache's offer of peace felt more terrifying than his threat of war, because it demanded a leap of faith I wasn't sure I was capable of making. The young translator's face was still a mask of controlled emotion, but I saw his eyes dart to Chato, then back to us, as if he, too, was trying to understand the magnitude of what was being proposed. He was a young man, perhaps only 20, with a thin scar running from his temple to his jaw. He had the look of a scholar forced into a soldier's life. The burden of Chato's words was clearly weighing on him. I saw other ranchers in my peripheral vision. There was Thompson, who I knew had lost a cousin to the Apache last spring. He was standing rigidly, his knuckles white on the barrel of his rifle. His eyes were fixed on Chato with a pure, unadulterated hatred. For him, this wasn't an opportunity for peace. It was a betrayal of his cousin's memory. He'd likely never forgive them, regardless of the offer. For him, the blood had been spilled, and only more blood could wash it away. And then there was Smith, a quiet, thoughtful man who kept a small journal of the constellations. He'd buried 2 sons to fever, not to violence, and he had a soft spot for anyone who'd lost a child. He was looking at Chato with an expression I could only describe as recognition. He saw a fellow mourner. The stark, sun-scorched landscape seemed to shrink in around us. The mountains, which I'd always seen as a beautiful backdrop to my life, now looked like the jagged teeth of some sleeping beast. The smell of the dust, the creak of leather, the nervous shuffling of boots, all of it was heightened, made hyperreal by the tension. Chato, standing there in the middle of our 2 groups, seemed not to notice the turmoil he'd created. He had the patient, expectant look of a man who had just laid a winning hand on the table. He was the only one among us who seemed at peace. I noticed the way the breeze ruffled the fringe on his buckskin shirt. It moved with a gentle rhythm, as if he were not separate from the wind but a part of it. My mind raced. Was he lying? The offer was too good, a promise to stop the fighting. What did that even mean? To what boundary lines was he referring? The army would never accept a treaty based on a promise. The government would never recognize a border set by a mountain man. The offer seemed to be built on a foundation of air. But it also held Elias, my brother, the answer to my 3 months of prayer and despair. Slowly I stepped forward. I was shaking, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. The other ranchers turned to look at me, their faces a mixture of surprise and wariness. I want to see him, I said, my voice cracking. I want to see Elias. The translator spoke to Chato in their low, melodious tongue. Chato listened, then nodded slowly. He turned and said a few words to the cluster of Apache behind him. A movement rippled through them, a silent discussion. Then 2 men detached themselves from the group and walked back towards the distant tree line. The waiting was agonizing. The sun was now a blinding white disk. My mouth was dry. I could feel the cold, hard shape of my revolver pressing against my hip, a comforting weight, yet one I suddenly felt ashamed to be carrying. For an hour we stood there. The ranchers began to mutter among themselves, a low, angry buzz. I heard Barnaby complaining that this was a trick to stall for time, that their warriors were probably surrounding us. But Chato stood his ground, his gaze fixed on the mountains, completely indifferent to our fears. When the 2 men returned, they were walking slowly, supporting a 3rd figure between them. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I felt it in my throat. As they drew closer, I could make out the figure. It was thin, gaunt, dressed in rags. He was leaning heavily on the two men, and as they got within 20 feet, he lifted his head. It was Elias, my brother. His face was thinner, ravaged by suffering. There was a long, puckered scar that ran from his brow to his jawline, and his arm was bound in a sling. His eyes were sunken and dark, but they were his eyes, the same gray as mine. He looked at me, and a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "John," he croaked. It was just my name, but it was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. The dam of my composure finally broke. I stumbled forward, ignoring the rifles and the stairs, and wrapped my arms around him. He was all bones and trembling weakness, and I was terrified I might break him. I could smell the wood smoke and the strange, herbal scent of whatever medicine they'd been using on him. He was alive. They hadn't just spared him, they had healed him. They had given him back to me. I held on to him for a long time. When I finally pulled back, I was crying. I made no attempt to hide it. I looked at Chato, this old, dignified man who seemed to hold the entire valley in his gaze. He was watching me with a stoic expression that was somehow not cold. It was patient, like he was waiting for me to understand what he already knew. "Thank you," I whispered. It felt wholly inadequate. It felt like a slap in the face to the enormity of what he had just done. I understood, on some fundamental level that bypassed my brain and went straight to my soul, what he was saying. He was giving up his own son's life, for all he knew, to buy peace with his enemies. He was making a sacrifice of unimaginable pain to stop the cycle of loss. He had traded the certainty of grief for the possibility of a future. He had shown a humanity so profound that it made me ashamed of the hate I had carried for him and his people. But the real test was just beginning. As I led my brother back to our group, Thompson stepped forward. His face was white with rage. "This is a trick," he snarled, leveling his rifle at Chato. "They're buying time to maneuver. You think the boy comes back and everything is forgiven. My cousin is dead. Their hands are covered in his blood. I'll not rest until he pays." The air crackled with a new, more immediate danger. Chato's warriors tensed. Weapons were half raised. We were on the precipice of a massacre, and the peace Chato had offered was a fragile, fading echo. The world narrowed to the point of Thompson's rifle. It was an old, worn Winchester, but it was pointed with deadly intent at Chato's chest. The offer, the miracle of my brother's return, all of it balanced on the razor's edge of that one man's grief and rage. I saw the moment in Chato's eyes. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just looked at Thompson, and for a fraction of a second, something ancient and sorrowful passed over his features. He wasn't afraid of Thompson's rifle. He had stared into the face of death 1,000 times. What he felt, I think, was a profound disappointment. He had made a gesture of ultimate trust, a sacrifice so deep it could only be understood by someone who had lost everything, and it was being met with the same old hatred. "Put the rifle down, Thompson," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. The fear had been replaced by a cold, clear anger. I couldn't believe his stupidity. My brother, who was still leaning against me, flinched at the sound of my voice, his eyes wide with terror. He had just been returned from the grip of a nightmare, and now the nightmare was following him home. "Mind your own business, Webb," Thompson spat, his eyes never leaving Chato. "This ain't your fight. They had your kin and they gave him back, but they ain't got mine. All I got is a memory of a boy with a smile and a dream to be a doctor. They took that. And this man just gave up his own son to stop more of that," I shouted, gesturing at Chato. "Don't you see? He's trying to stop it. He knows more about loss than you ever will because he's living it right now. His son is a ghost in a blue coat's prison, if he's even alive at all, and he's still here trying to make peace." Silence. The only sounds were the wind, the nervous shuffling of a horse, and the ragged, desperate breaths of the men around us. Thompson's face was a maelstrom of emotion, rage, confusion, and a stubborn pride that wouldn't let him back down. His rifle barrel wavered. For a second I thought it would be okay. But then Barnaby, who had been sweating and quiet, made a fatal error. He panicked. His hand darted to his side, reaching for his own pistol. It was a reflex born of 1,000 whispered stories of Apache treachery. But his movement was like a match to dry tinder. A young Apache warrior, his face painted with the stark lines of war, let out a high, piercing cry and lunged forward, a knife appearing in his hand as if from thin air. The next few seconds were a blur. Thompson fired his rifle. The shot was deafening in the still air, but it went wild as someone shoved him. The young Apache, screaming a war cry, was tackled by one of his own people. Another rancher raised his gun. I saw Chato's face, a mask of deep, unutterable sorrow. He shouted a single, powerful word. The young warrior on the ground went still, his eyes blazing with defiance but his body frozen. The rancher who had raised his gun hesitated. I felt someone grab my arm. It was Smith, the quiet man who kept a journal of the stars. His face was pale. "Get your brother out of here," he hissed. "Now, while everyone's hesitating. This is going to go bad, it's going to go very bad." I knew he was right. I wrapped my arm around Elias and half-carried, half-dragged him away from the center of our two groups. My eyes were locked on Chato. He was in the middle of the chaos, a rock in the stream of violence. He was speaking again, his voice low and commanding. He wasn't shouting, but every Apache within earshot was listening. He was holding his hands out again, those long, expressive fingers, and the silver ring glinted in the sun. He was trying to soothe his warriors. He was trying to save our lives. I got Elias behind a large boulder out of the direct line of fire. I pulled my own revolver. It felt clumsy and stupid in my hand. I was a cattleman, a fence fixer. I wasn't a soldier. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. Then the moment of pure horror. Thompson, his face a contorted mask of rage, pushed his way forward again. He raised his rifle. This time he didn't miss. He fired directly at Chato's chest. The old mountain man's body jerked backward, a spurt of blood blooming on his buckskin shirt like a dark flower. He fell to his knees, his eyes wide with shock and a terrible, profound betrayal. The world exploded. The Apache, who had been barely holding back, let out a chorus of war cries that seemed to shake the very ground. They surged forward. The ranchers returned fire. It was pandemonium. Dust and smoke filled the air. I fired my own revolver over the boulder, but I aimed high. I couldn't shoot at them. I had just seen a man whose name I knew to be Chato, give me back my brother and offer a peace he knew was probably impossible. I had just seen him die for that offer. In the chaos, I saw the young warrior who had attacked earlier. He broke free from his restraints and with a scream of pure rage, he lunged at Thompson. They went down in a tangle of arms and dust. I heard a sickening, wet sound. I saw Smith, the stargazer, drag another rancher behind a line of rocks. I saw Barnaby, screaming in fear, trying to reload his rifle with fumbling, useless hands. Elias was beside me, whimpering with fear and pain. I had to get him out of there. But a part of me, a part I hated, wanted to stay and see the end of it. I wanted to see what had become of Chato. I wanted to know if his sacrifice had been in vain. The battle, if you could call it that, was over as quickly as it had begun. It wasn't a battle. It was a frenzy of panic and rage that burned itself out in minutes. The Apache, realizing the advantage was fleeting and knowing they were outgunned in the long run, melted back into the desert, taking their dead and their wounded with them. We were left with our own casualties. Thompson was dead, his body sprawled in the dust, his throat cut. Another rancher, a young kid barely out of his teens, lay with a bullet in his stomach, moaning softly. Barnaby was on his knees, his face gray, vomiting into the dirt. The smell of blood and gunpowder was thick and cloying in the air. The silence that followed was heavier and more terrible than the one before. The mountain man's offer, that beautiful, impossible vision of peace, lay dead with him in the dust. I left Elias with Smith, who was trying to staunch the young kid's bleeding, and I walked back to the center of the carnage. Chato was still on his knees, slumped forward. I wasn't sure if he was dead. I walked closer, my boots crunching on the gravel. A fly was already buzzing around his head. He was so still. I knelt beside him. I could see the hole in his chest, the bright red blood that had soaked his shirt. It was a fatal wound. There was no doubt about it. But then his eyes fluttered open. They were the eyes of a man who had been to the edge of the spirit world and was forced to return. They were filled with an unfathomable pain, and yet, as they focused on me, I saw something else. A glimmer of recognition. Hope. He tried to speak. A wet, gurgling sound escaped his lips. "The promise," he rasped, his voice a mere whisper. "The promise you must remember." I shook my head, tears blurring my vision. "I didn't promise anything," I said, my voice breaking. I just wanted my brother back. I didn't agree to anything. I was just a bystander. I didn't know what to do." "I know," he whispered. "I know you didn't, but I gave you my son. I gave you hope. You must keep the hope alive. I don't ask you to fight for me. I don't ask you to understand the spirits. I just ask you remember the offer." He closed his eyes, and a shudder ran through his body. I thought he was dead. But then his eyes opened again, and he looked at me with an intensity that felt like he was boring a hole right into my soul. "My son," he breathed. "You find him, you help him. He carries the old ways. He carries the promise I could not keep. The mountains will show you the way. The birds will tell you where he is. I have been a man of the mountains all my life. You are a good man, John Webb. You have a heart that can hold the sorrow. You will find him. Tell him. Tell him his father died with his name on his lips. Tell him the promise was not broken." A rattling sigh escaped his lips, and the light in his eyes faded. He was gone. I was kneeling in the dust, holding the hand of a dead man I had been ready to hate just hours before. The man who had killed and been killed. The man who had given me back my life and whose last request was a burden I never thought I'd carry. I heard the heavy footsteps of my fellow ranchers approaching. I looked up. They were staring down at us, at the dead man and me, with a mixture of shock, confusion, and guilt. "We have to get out of here before they come back," Barnaby said, his voice hoarse. "We're sitting ducks." I looked back at Chato's face. It was peaceful now. The lines of sorrow and struggle had smoothed out. In death, he looked like the mountain, ancient and eternal. I looked at his right hand, still resting on the ground. I saw the ring, the simple silver band. I couldn't leave him like this, a target for scavengers. I couldn't leave his last request unfulfilled. "We're not leaving him," I said. The words came out harder than I intended. "We're burying him." "The hell we are," Barnaby sputtered. "They'll be back any minute." "They're not coming back," Smith said, walking up to join us. He looked at Chato's body, and I saw a flicker of profound respect in his eyes. "They know he's dead. They'll go into mourning now. They won't risk any more lives today." He stopped it. "He died for it," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I took the ring off Chato's finger. It was warm from his skin. I slipped it into my own pocket, next to the obsidian stone I dropped and picked up again without thinking. "And I'm going to make sure his son knows." The ranchers were silent. The weight of the day, the violence, the sacrifice, and the promise was settling on us all. We found a shallow wash nearby, and with our bare hands and our shovels, we dug a grave for a man we barely knew. We didn't have a preacher, so we just stood there, a group of broken, stunned men, looking at the heap of dirt over a man who had tried to bridge an impossible divide. I said a few words. I told them Chato was a man who loved his son more than he hated his enemies. I told them he was a man of the old ways, a man of the mountains, and I hoped he was walking with his ancestors now. I left the valley that day, not just with my brother, but with a purpose I never expected to have. I carried the ring in my pocket like a talisman. I didn't know how I was going to find Strong Bear, a man I'd never met, a man who might be dead, a man I was supposed to treat like a brother. Weeks later, I would visit Elias, who was slowly recovering on my ranch. I'd tell him the whole story, how the man who had held him prisoner had also saved him. We'd sit on the porch, and I'd look up at the mountains, the same mountains Chato had claimed as his home. The memory of his eyes, filled with the terrible pain and the quiet hope, never left me. The man who had made the offer no one expected was gone, but he had left me with the echo of a promise that demanded more of me than I had ever given anyone, a promise that bound me to a stranger in a way that was deeper and more profound than I could have ever imagined. The promise wasn't just to find a son. It was to honor a vision of peace that had cost a man his life. It was a debt I was determined to repay. I'd stand there, looking at the peaks that were so often wreathed in the dark, brooding clouds, and I'd think about the day the crowd watched in silence. I'd think about the man who had died for something he truly believed in. And I'd know, with a certainty that was as solid as the ground beneath my feet, that my life had been forever changed. The weight of his final words was a burden I would carry for the rest of my days, a constant reminder that peace is not a gift, but a sacrifice.